what the frick is headless, right? Like, that's what we're going to talk about here. So this is going to be our last two sessions of the day. I'm joined by one of my business partners, John, the CTO of Trellis, as well as now our stead and Trudy returning panelist, Alfred from Tb12. So I'll probably save him from introducing himself. But we're going to have a really high-level conversation just around headless. Hopefully some of it's eliminating. I wanted to make sure that I was involved in this. Super non-technical. I know a lot of us are like, what the heck is headless? When should I think about it? It's kind of like one of those techie buzzwords. I think Alfred has a really interesting story. Trellis previously supported their headless instance. He made some move to the really powerful Shopify Plus platform. I'm sure he has some things to share about if he could do it again, what he would do. But anyway, I'll let John introduce himself.
Hi, my name is John Cymerman. I'm the CTO of Trellis, so sort of in charge of all the engineering, technical stuff. Oh, what's wrong?
I don't know if the microphone's working. Or maybe just closer.
Maybe just closer?
There we go.
All right. So, yeah, so I'm in charge of the technical positions at Trellis, so all the engineering and QA, DevOps reports up through me. Then,
awesome. John is the brains behind our operation. You're definitely going to be able to share a lot of valuable insights. As I mentioned, Alfred, welcome back.
Thank you.
Up here. Great to have you. So I want to toss out a question, which I know I wrestle with all the time, which is like headless, like trend to stay. Like, how do we even define headless, right? Like, we're coming up to Halloween. Is it some kind of character? Is it some scary thing? Like, what is headless? Like, how should we define it and think about it?
Yeah, sure. So a headless website would be a website that is, philosophically, it's when a website is detached from the back-end server side. So typically, in a traditional e-commerce website, the main rendering and processing of the experience that you see happens on the server side of things. On a headless website, the entire experience is sort of pre-rendered, and then data gets pulled in from other systems. So there's a lot less processing before the initial page load that happens on the server side. And the sort of communication about the data is happening through what we would call an API, or basically an application interface that returns the information back to the front-end application.
Yeah, thanks. And before we started the panel, I was joking that he was going to run circles around me technically, so I won't try to expand too much on the technical nature of headless versus Shopify-centric. But I think one of the areas maybe I can add a little value is from a brand perspective or from a website builder perspective, what are some of the pros and cons of each? And I've lived through both and experienced both. And I think if you're looking for ultimate flexibility, you have a core competency in website development, and you have the team that can support scaling and maintaining a headless site. Headless is, it's the better way to go. You can have those direct integrations. Your site can be faster. There's a variety of reasons why you would want to be on a headless platform. It's really more a representation, or more important, about the life cycle of the business and kind of where the business exists, what those business needs are in terms of management. And then obviously with a Shopify-centric storefront, there are some limitations in terms of the ability to customize, make some of those what I'll call more like bespoke treatments and packages can be harder to do on a Shopify site, but it is easier to maintain. It's more manageable for teams. I mean, put very simply with a metaphor, think of a Shopify site kind of like a Toyota. It's going to get you there. It's going to function. Headless site is more like some of those German cars you might see, where it's a little more to maintain. It might break a little more often, but ultimately it's going to be, at its peak, it's going to be a far better performer. Is that good metaphor? I like to kind of boil it down.
Yeah, I would say like it's even more so like a headless website would be like a custom hand-built car made like just for you, one out of one, like collector's edition, right? Where basically you can have it function any way that you please, but you're going to require a lot of man hours to get there and then to continue to stay there, right? So that's I would say the big trade-off is that with Toyotas you can get a bunch of aftermarket parts stapled onto your Toyota at any point that you choose. there's a big industry, third-party industry that is behind it. Whereas with Headless, you're doing a lot more yourself with your own team or with with an agency to add content, maintain content, build out new parts, new sections of the website. It will be a lot more labor to get there.
Yeah, I think that's a great lead-in. I mean, I'll give you my take, whether you guys care or not. I think the trivia is probably enough for everyone around here. But, it probably makes John quiver as our technical lead over at Trellis. But one of the amazing things is obviously people are really excited. I mean, we saw a lot of first movers to Headless. And what I always tell people is it gives you an absolute ton of freedom. Whatever kind of product experiences, content experiences you want to feed, especially with a super stable platform like Shopify, where you don't have to worry about the downside of your site. And you're like, well, I can deal with some additional custom things. It's kind of like a good accessory. You can build it into whatever you want, much like sort of, I guess, my decision to get earrings in college. It's whether you're ready for it or not, and everyone thinks it's very trendy is probably up to debate. But you guys were sort of alluding into something I wanted to dig into, which is like, how do you guys think you prepare? Like, what's necessary to even think about going headless? Like, what are table stakes versus things that are like SOS? Don't even think about it. You're not ready.
Sure. Yeah, so I would say a lot of the functionality you're leveraging should be API accessible, which is not always the case, right? And that's becoming more and more the case now. Is that, let's say you're on a Shopify website and you're using some third-party apps. Some of these have some amount of API accessibility. Some of them have none. Some of them have full. So you really want to take a careful look at all of the functionality that you're currently leveraging with your existing solution. And you want to take a look at how much of that is independent and can be broken away from the website itself. How much is built into the theme files, and how much are you relying on the contents of those theme files? Whereas how much of that is in its own sequestered JS that can be reconnected to other elements of the page independently, right? Like, these are the kinds of things you have to look at to determine the amount of work it's going to take to get there, and how ready you are to take that next step.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, and you're making it tough to elaborate. But I think one of the things that when I think about the headless decision versus going more centralized, I get that question a lot. And the other question that I think comes along with that is, what does the ideal tech stack look like? That's, I think, a very common question in the direct-to-consumer marketplace right now, and it's really the starting point for the headless versus non-headless decision. And the answer I give to people consistently is, while it's easy to say there's this ideal tech stack, the reality is every business is different. Every business has different objectives. Every business has different positioning. And so, when I think about website building, I think about what is the goal of the website I'm making? Am I trying to create an immersive experience? Am I focused on conversion? Am I focused on presenting a product? What's really the goal, and what is the takeaway I want from someone visiting my website? And if from my perspective, if I'm focused more on the consumer experience, I want to create an immersive experience. I want it to be something that's really unique in the marketplace, and I want a lot of that flexibility, and those are the business goals for my website. I think headless becomes, a natural kind of trajectory to follow, whereas if I'm a more product-centric brand, our core competency is really in, manufacturing or presentation of those goods, or really, from a branding perspective, if I'm just a brand with a great product that I want to get out there and it's really just a conversion channel for me and it's a relatively simple sell, then I think a headless site is probably a little bit more than you need, and could be potentially a little bit burdensome for your team. So I think that everyone wants these fast, simple answers in e-commerce, and I just think that to really make the best strategic decisions for your brand or your team, it really is taking all of those inputs and all of the considerations, and ultimately like weighing the pros and cons of each. There's not one straightforward answer, as much as everyone wants there to be one.
Yeah. So something I heard was the absolute need for sort of APIs and connectivity. We have both merchants as well as software providers here. Is it, as much as I say, is it a fair assertion to say, when you're thinking about your overall tech stack, and even for the software providers, when you're thinking about who you're partnering with, that it's incredibly important for them to be open and therefore be able to connect, and therefore you should be thinking about this a year or two in advance versus maybe selecting things that don't have open APIs. Is that fair? Or?
Do you want to take that one?
Oh, you can start if you want.
Yeah, I think I think that when it comes to tech stack, headless or not, like the integrations on the connectivity between platforms is ultimately what's going to make or break the success of your e-commerce brand or website. And one of the things that's been really interesting for me to take part of, I think, Jared, like what was really implicit in your question was this, like, how do things change over time and how do things evolve and how do you, in the moment now, look at where things are going? And I think that's really, a key part of the thinking. And so for nascent brands, I think, Shopify-centric storefronts will continue to be the future. But then I also look at, the improvements Shopify's made, for example, in the headless ecosystem with the new hydrogen product that they have. And I think as I look at the landscape and ecosystem, I think about the connectivity. I think about all of the ways we can optimize web experiences moving forward. I think headless is only going to become a more attainable and accessible option for brands moving forward. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit on some of that API connectivity as well.
Sure. Yeah. Let me talk a little bit about what are some pros and cons that set up your decision to go one way or the other, because I think there's a lot of factors, and I think if you want to make an educated decision about whether or not to go headless, you really do need to kind of dig into the details about what am I looking for out of my system versus not. One thing that would drive you towards headless is if you have multiple systems that you want to use to drive the user experience. So like, let's say you want the inventory information about products to come directly from your ERP. You don't want a delay. Let's say you want information about different warehouses that are located close to the customer versus far away, like maybe like a warehouse search, right? So you want that information to also come from the ERP and not your e-com system. And then maybe you have information about like your local stores, and that comes from a different system entirely, right? So like buy online, pick up in store, we talked about earlier. So if you have all these different systems you want to integrate into the user experience, that's a pro towards headless. That would drive you towards headless. Something that may detract you from wanting to go headless would be something like you want your marketing team to constantly be updating your current promotions and adding new content, right? You want a lot of self-maintained content, and you have a big team that maintains and develops that content constantly. Maybe you're doing daily or weekly updates to that information. Something like that, you wouldn't want, that would detract you from headless because there's less tools out there to help you self-maintain that content quickly and easily. Whereas, yeah, some e-commerce system like Shopify, the CMS control and the administrative capabilities, you're going to be able to leverage way better, right? So these are the different things that would kind of drive you towards one direction or the other.
Awesome. Well, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Guys, there's someone up here who fired Trellis. It's TB12. Let's talk about this for a second. I think it's a really good learning opportunity. And by the way, obviously we're friends, and it had nothing really to do with the relationship, as it should be obvious. We still partner strategically all the time. But I think a lot of this probably had to do, Alfred, and it's interesting to have my CTO up here as well, with the fact that you guys were on Headless. We inherited this site, guys. Trellis is great. We inherited the site already headless. You were among one of the first movers, very innovative as a company. Care to touch on like some lessons learned, or where the decision came really to refactor purely on Shopify Plus, and what you did different?
I think it's a really interesting story, and I think a really illustrative example of a lot of the themes we're hitting on here. So some of this predates even my time at TB12, but long story short, when I joined TB12, we had made a decision to launch a headless website. And kind of going back to the car analogy prior, when you're making a car that's one of one and it's really custom made for you, if you don't have a great vision for what you want that car to be, you end up with a car that doesn't really work that well for your needs. And I think that was kind of the reality. We had ambitions to really be innovators and create this immersive digital experience. And the reality, and this predates our time with Trellis as well, the reality of the headless site we built was that it was too large, too complicated, too intricate for the state of our business and the scale of our business at that point in time. And I also think because we weren't super in line with our past developers in terms of what our objectives were, what really we needed that car to be, it led to something where, you know, the website was ultimately kind of like a house of cards for us. We didn't have the internal capabilities or the internal expertise to really manage and optimize the headless site. So over the term of our engagement, basically what happened was we brought the Trellis team in to just help us clean up this mess that was our headless site. And over the course of, you know, a year or two, we had a really fantastic engagement and ultimately made some really, you know, great improvements on our headless template, made it structured in a way that it was, you know, at the very least operating for our needs. But as we really looked at, you know, the grand scope and really reevaluated what capabilities does our team have? What's important to us as a business? What are our goals for our website? What does our business look right now, and where do we want to go in the immediate future? It became obvious that, you know, we had kind of gotten a little ahead of ourselves with a headless website. We were we were a merchant. We were focused on selling products and educating, and that for, you know, the life cycle of our business and the stage we were at, the Shopify platform had, you know, the robust feature sets that we needed. And as part of the transition back to Shopify, we did, you know, lose some of those direct API connections that were powerful, helped with site load times, and there's certainly trade-offs to both approaches. But as we went back to a Shopify-centric site, we regained some of the autonomy internally to be able to manage our site. Like the site doesn't crash anymore without us knowing, and if it were to, we could troubleshoot and identify and do that quickly. And for a growing brand, as I kind of hit on early, really staying agile, flexible, and, you know, being able to deal with problems as they come up and put out fires quickly is really of the utmost importance. So as we transition back to a Shopify-centric storefront, we moved to Recharge and really focused on the integrations within the App Store. It was really, you know, I think it was the best decision for the state of our business at the time. We've been on Shopify now for a year plus, and it's been a great platform. But as Jared and I were kind of talking about earlier, like, I don't know if 3 years from now that will be the best setup for us. I think it's, as business leaders, we need to continually look at it. Constantly, those inputs and outputs are changing. Those pros and cons are changing. The goals and initiatives evolve. And I think it's just something you have to constantly be evaluating with your team and investing where and when you think is best. And yeah, so I think that's the story of our engagement, you know, Headless and Shopify working with Trellis. And I think it's a case-by-case basis. And also, you know, if anyone has follow-up questions or I can elaborate on it further, like, I'm happy to do so after the panel. But hopefully that just gives you guys like a little taste of kind of some of the war stories and the pros and cons of each.
Yeah, so, you know, John, talking on a technical side, I mean, I get to watch it from the sideline, whether it's TB12, you know, brands work going in both directions. Is there any sort of commonalities you see between the folks that really thrive and grow on a headless infrastructure versus those where it either causes some friction points between agency partner and client, or internally if they take it all on themselves?
Yeah, I would say, you know, a commonality that I find is it's companies that are ready to invest, right? They have a goal in mind, and they're willing to accept the timeline and budget trade-offs of going for a headless solution, right? It's not something that's going to take 10% longer and cost you 10% more. It's more, we're talking more like 50% or something like that, right? Depending on exactly the nature of the project. So it's a client they're willing to accept, you know, the fact that this may require some adjustments with the systems that they're using today. Maybe they have to migrate to something that's more set up for API access, more set up for building off of from a headless perspective, and they're willing for it to take a while. I'll use the story of Trellis.co, which itself became a headless website, I guess over a year and a half ago at this point. And, you know, I think just recently we started to see some of the major benefits of, we switched from using JazzHR for applicant tracking to now using Rippling ATS for applicant tracking. And the switch from one to the other was relatively painless. And that's because we were using a headless website where a lot of the change just happened on the front end. We didn't have to get into the back end and writing custom WordPress classes or anything like that. We just we were able to change things on the front end perspective and then latch into all of the hooks that Rippling has and just very easily leverage that, right? So I think a lot of the payoffs come in the much longer term. and you have to be willing to accept the upfront investment. And that's a huge component of where we see it successful versus if things are more on the need to go fast, need to see immediate results. If you're more on that side of things, then a headless framework is maybe not the best choice for you right now, right? So,
absolutely. Yeah, I think personally we had the advantage that we were not the first movers to headless. We had some clients that did it first, and I think the rest of the technology stack beyond sort of CMS, which is feeding all that content, everything beautiful on the front end, is now catching up. I mean, perfect example, Shopify Plus, having their announcement around hydrogen and oxygen. I'm sure it had Alfred, come fresh with some of these great sort of revelations that have happened, and maybe 2 years from now, as their needs grow and their internal stack grows, we'll be talking about it again. So last remarks here, and we'll move on to our last session. Answer the question: headless, trend, fad, or here to stay? Is it the future, guys?
I'll take that one first, and then I'll pass it to you for, I'm sure, a far more educated take. But I think that the short answer is that they're both here to stay. I think that's the reality. Outside of my work with TB12, I also counsel a lot of entrepreneurs, try to work in the small business community, and I think for people that are trying to create a brand, or I was talking to someone earlier, really that 0 to 1 for me, having a Shopify storefront is the way to go. When you're really trying to figure something out, my perspective is looking at things through that lean entrepreneurial method, minimizing your potential downside risk, minimizing upfront expenditures, and making sure that you're staying agile and flexible as you scale. And I think for most merchants and emerging brands, Shopify does a great job of getting you to 10 million or even 100 million or maybe even $1 billion in revenue. It's a great driver there. For some of these brands that might not be as product centric, they might be looking for more of a content engine, or have just absolutely massive scale and large dev teams and large budgets to support the ongoing maintenance and development. A headless site's the way to go, certainly, absolutely. And I think the part that's really cool for me is to see the evolution, see that there's offerings kind of across the ecosystem that are right for businesses at different sizes. And just speaking to the hydrogen front and just some of the evolution, I think as we continue towards the future, like those lines will just get even a little bit blurrier in the sense that I think headless is going to move downstream and become a little bit more accessible for some of these emerging brands. And I think that the Shopify ecosystem is also going to scale up and focus on a lot of those enterprise or at scale customers. So I'm really excited for the future ahead. And I think the bottom line is that merchants and brands have more options than ever in terms of their tech stack. And it's really just, the brands can decide what works best for them. And I think, at least for me and my experience at TB12, that was what was so cool, is that there's an ecosystem out there. I can do my due diligence, my research, make a decision based on my business context. And that can be ever changing and ever evolving. And, tomorrow I might feel differently. And I think that type of thought evolution and flexibility is one of the things that, honestly, I love most about the e-commerce space and digital commerce, is just that everything's happening so fast. There's no wrong answer. So sorry, I'll start my rant, but I think that's my perspective there.
You're sure not the technical one here? I don't know, Alfred. After a little pain, it seems like you've learned a little bit here.
Yeah, I mean, my perspective on it is very similar in that both sides are going to meet in the middle. Really, right now, headless doesn't have enough tooling behind it. It has developed from maybe a year or two ago, but it's still more or less in its infancy. And what I think we're going to see is the e-commerce platform start to incorporate it, like basically like Shopify 3.0 or what have you. Will be a lot more towards like a progressive web app than Shopify 2.0 is, and it's just going to keep sort of merging together. Much like how originally Web 2.0, you want to build a responsive website, great, go write the CSS, the browser-specific CSS commands to make all the different browsers do something equivalent to what responsive is. Well, if you want to build a responsive website today, you just start from a responsive theme and you modify from there, and there's all these media queries and CSS commands to make that easier. You don't have to do browser-specific weird stuff anymore. So similar way, Shopify and other e-commerce platforms are going to start to integrate the methodology of Headless, and instead of doing things natively through template liquid files, you'll instead just pull the same stuff via API calls, and you'll add in other systems as necessary. So Shopify will become more of a platform of like hosting PWAs with e-commerce API support than just being sort of like innate, doing stuff more innately. So if that makes sense. So that's where I kind of see things going, is like it all merging together. Sure, the competitors in the market may change. Some will go up, some will go down, but the overall philosophy of PWA is here to stay. It's just like how the different entities out there incorporate it more over time.
What I'm hearing is Shopify is really improving. They're taking our jobs. The next question I have for the panel is, who else's jobs are getting taken over by AI and these damn machines?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, actually, no one will be writing the websites anymore. It's just going to be AI just writing the website for you.